There we go.
Hi, everybody. My name is Daisy. I know some of you might not know me. I am the new director of Code the Dream. I went through the Code the Dream class about 3 years ago, and then I spent 2 years at Duke University as a developer. I wanted to bring in a guest speaker today. Part of the experience of being a developer is learning from other developers and kind of building the network. So I wanted to introduce you to Kelly Murray. She was most recently a front-end instructor at the Iron Yard, which is a code boot camp here in downtown Durham. And she is actually moving on to IBM, starting very soon. So let's hear from Kelly.
Well, thank you, Daisy. Hi. This is a really big class. It's so exciting to see. So Daisy covered a lot of what I am. I started coding when I was 12. That was 21 years ago. I always have to admit that number, but I'm not doing it. And the way I started coding was I wanted to find websites like for girls like me at that age, right? And were maybe interested in the environment or social justice or whatever might be the thing. And there was nothing. So I went to the library and I checked out the first edition of HTML for Dummies. Went back and I was like, all right, I'm just gonna make sure there's nothing there. And I Googled like girls sites. Don't ever Google girls sites because you're going to get things you don't want to see. I got an education at a very young age, and at that point decided maybe we need more voices of coding in tech. But I'll tell you the truth, for a while I was not in tech after that. All through high school I was coding. I got to college, I was going to be a computer engineering program, and I went to the dean of the program. We had to interview, and he said, "You've got a B+ in Algebra 2. I don't think you're a good fit for this field." And I was 18, and I was like, oh, I bet I dodged a bullet. I'll just go do English or something. Well, now we know that's bunk, right? How many times do you really use math and coding, especially the kind of coding that we like to do? Not really that often, right? At least not that hard mathematics. So ended up coming back to the field after I had done graduate school, got a master's degree in something else that was related to coding, but kind of a little more tangentially. And now I've been back in the field for quite some time. So I'm here to answer all your questions, whether it's about interviews or coding in general. Daisy mentioned React gotchas, but my biggest gotcha for React is it's React. So just take it slow, man. That's the biggest gotcha, right? Yeah, you know what I mean. Like states and props and oh my lord. But I definitely specialize in the front end. So if you have any questions about the field as it looks, I'm here for it. I know it's super awkward, right? Yeah.
How many times have you applied before you got the first job?
Tech. So this was a case of who you know. I had not even fully decided if I was going to go back into tech. I was coding again. I was enjoying it. But I had this master's degree in public history, which was kind of like doing websites and web apps for museums, right? It's a nonprofit stuff. Very rare work, a lot less work than you might think for that. And I happened to know somebody from graduate school who had gotten a degree in something completely different, non-tech related. And she had started working in San Francisco at a tech company. And she said, hey, we need somebody for this job. Do you want to interview? And I thought, okay, why not? And ended up getting the job. So my big lesson for you, network. Like that's honestly the #1 thing you can do in tech. It's not what you know, it's who you know.
I kind of echo that experience. My first job at Duke, it was the person I kind of met through a friend, and I told her I'm in code school and I really enjoy it and I'm looking for a job. She eventually got a promotion just at the time I was looking for a job, and so she reached out to me. So it really is about networking, and even if you don't have to get your resume perfect, you don't have to be completely solid, even solid on a project. You just start telling people, hey, I'm a developer, I'm learning this stuff, and I really enjoy it, and they'll remember you. They'll remember your passion. They'll remember, how you kind of presented yourself to them, and then when they hear of a position, they'll think of you.
Yeah, for sure. She had actually just gotten recently promoted too, and it was just the perfect alignment. At that point, I had started talking to her about like, hey, you know what? I'm starting to get back into this. I started doing it for my master's degree. I think I really enjoy it. I don't know where I want to go from here. So let's get out to those meetups. How many of you have a meetup.com account? Oh, yeah, okay, well, it needs to be every hand.
Yeah.
They're free. I hate going to meetups. Like, it terrifies me. I hate going. I get there and I like stand in the corner until I see someone I know, and then I'm like, Daisy, hi! And I don't really do the networking I should do, right? Yeah, for sure. But so helpful. That's somehow I've gotten a lot of my jobs in town is through going to meetups, networking, meeting people, and just talking a little bit about what you're passionate about. I usually have about 10 projects going at once, none of which will ever be finished. And just being able to just talk about them a little bit, and like, yeah, I'm building this API because I think it'd be cool to like have a wine database. People are like, oh, cool, tell me more about that. So even the projects you're doing in here, really great things to talk about. What kind of projects are you doing here?
So we're, for the most part right now, we're working through a book online. It's called Survive.js, and it has you building a Kanban style board
Oh,
with
cool.
React.
That's cool. How do you feel about the project so far? All the good and the bad.
I'm a little confused, just because React, it's still kind of new, even though it's very popular, it's still kind of new, and it's still changing a lot. So when I'm looking at React right now, you start seeing all these React 16 things now, which is different from what we're learning right now.
Right.
So I get so confused of all these create class, which
Right.
is created right now,
Yeah.
and this whole state and props
Right.
and how to design React the best way for React to know
Right.
and for React to be optimized to the best it can.
Yeah.
That's what I've been hearing.
Yeah.
So
For sure, I completely hear you on that. One of the things I will say that it took me a long time to learn. I started coding with Angular, like back when it was like 1 point something. And all of a sudden Angular 2 was out. And it was like, there's no more, where are the Angular 1 resources? Should I be doing Angular 2? I'm in the middle of this project. My mentor told me, just stick with what you got for now and learn it really good. Because the sooner you learn one thing, everything else will come that much faster as you begin to learn. Right? So it's kind of like you learn JavaScript, and suddenly maybe Ruby's a little bit easier for you later because you understand the concepts behind it. So just stick with that React 15. You're at 15, right? You're on 15, yeah.
yeah, we're
Stick with React 15. It's actually still really widely used, and you don't want to be that bleeding edge. Stick with the 15. Get really good at that, and then you can talk about that with people, and it won't be such a hard jump when you do decide, if you decide, to go to 16. There's an old joke about between the time I started this talk and it ends, there will be a new JavaScript framework. So you don't even know what's going to be big next year.
yeah.
Concentrate on what you got. Yeah, React's got some batches. What else can I help answer or clarify?
How does your
You, and then you.
all right.
Oh, well,
It was okay.
it was
There-
one of his questions. I was gonna ask, how long did it take you, after, I guess, getting prepared for interviews? How long did it take?
It can take a while. So do you mean from when I started to code again and then decided to apply, or from when I heard about the job and started getting ready for the interview?
When you decided to code.
Yeah, it took a while. For me, part of that was because I was doing it part-time. And I had other jobs, I was in graduate school. I was literally working 4 jobs and going to graduate school full-time, so it was like a lot. And ended up, luckily one of those jobs had some coding in it. So I was kind of able to stay fresh and take some classes in graduate school. I would say it was probably about 3 months. I graduated, was looking for work, was looking at jobs that I felt I would be very lucky to have like a $22,000 a year job sort of thing in the field I was in. Like, all right, well, this is what I've chosen to do. The profession I've chosen, as they say in The Godfather. But is it going to fulfill me? So once I made that decision, though, that all right, I want to go back to tech, I got serious, and I really started reaching out to meetups and to people in the field that I had known in other ways, or maybe were tangentially related, and they can introduce me to people. And at that point, again, the network was like the strongest thing getting me ready to get ready for tech.
Yeah. So can you explain basically how is your day when you're at work?
Oh, yeah.
In software?
It depends. So I've had lots of different tech jobs that have been very different from each other. As far as a coding job, like I just go in to work. Usually I go in, I want to do a git pull first thing, right? Doing git pulls tools when you're on teams? Are they doing GitHub?
A little bit.
A little bit. Well, just keep that in the back of your mind for later. When you do start working in groups, right? You want to do a Git pull, so I get everybody's fresh code and make sure I'm there. I, at that point, usually will have a cup of coffee. Like, I'm not gonna lie, these kind of percolate. But throughout the day, a lot of it is a mix of coding and collaboration. So coding is a team sport. It's not like we had this idea back in like the 80s and 90s of the hacker in the basement and he's like, I'm in, right? We don't really do that. Usually you're working with other people on a team. So a lot of it is, all right, let's do our stand-up first thing in the morning. I don't know if you've done any agile. Essentially, it's like a little mini meeting, right? To say like, this is what I'm working on. This is what I need help on. This is what I hope to do today, right? So you do that with your group, and then we sit down and we try to hash out some answers. A lot of meetings, a lot more meetings than maybe you would want going into this field, because you think, all right, yeah, it's just gonna be me problem solving. Unfortunately, it's collaboration problem solving, or fortunately. So the great thing about all of you is you all have really varied life experiences, and you all have different jobs you come from. You're not like that kid who's just been coding for years in his mom's basement. So you have a lot of personality and communication skills that are now really viable and important in tech. So keep that in mind. Like, you all have things that you are bringing to tech that most standard graduates don't have. Also take lots of walks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. What are some of the ways actually when you get blocked on code that you get unstuck? I'm really always interested to hear this from people.
I like walks.
Walks.
I do. I also like talking with, like,
Yeah.
if I'm bouncing 2 or 3 ideas
Yeah.
around and I'm not sure, I grab somebody else. I'm just like,
Yeah,
what are you thinking?
Yeah.
And here's my thoughts, and
yeah.
what are your opinions on it? So,
I will even talk to my cats in my own coding, like, Kip, what do you think? I don't know, man, and sometimes it really works. I think the most detrimental thing you can do at this stage of your coding career is to not take those walks and not reach out for help and to get stuck and just keep doing this sort of head against the wall. I've been there. It ultimately will not help you solve that problem faster. Right? You're just gonna get a really bad headache. So when you feel like, all right, I've been on this problem for 15 minutes, it's time to go take a walk. Go take a walk. Go eat a sandwich. If you're the kind of person who go get a drink, whatever it might be, right? But just get out of your head a little bit, call your mom, come back, and you will almost always find the answer really fast after then. Not that long ago, a former student of mine, she now works at Blue Cross Blue Shield for the last 1.5 years. And she said, I remember you telling me that. And so I got up, I took a walk, and I got a coffee, and I sat back down, and she'd been working on this problem for 1.5 days. It took her 5 minutes to solve. So it's so strange what that perspective change can do. Help you. The questions may help answer it. Yeah.
I was wondering, maybe from your own perspective, but personal perspective, but also from what you've seen with students that you taught at Iron Yard, the idea that we hear very often that it doesn't necessarily matter which technology you study to get your foot in the door, but like especially at larger companies that they might hire you to do what you actually get hired to do might be totally different than what you feel competent in.
Absolutely. Not so much with me because I've always kind of positioned myself as a front-end developer and just sort of took the path to senior developer through there. But my students, they'll go through the back-end course and become front-end developers in their first job, or the front-end course and suddenly they're coding in Python. Honestly, it's learning the programmatic way of thinking that's the most important, and how you solve those problems. If you can show you're a good problem solver, a lot of companies will take a chance on you. So yeah, don't panic and think, oh my God, but React, what if they want this other thing? Or what if I want this Ruby job? All right, you got this, because you know the basics of programming now and that logical way of thinking. Where are some of you, like, what did you do before you decided to start coding, or what are you doing now? That's cool. The graphic design is always going to fit in well when you're interviewing, right? You got that artistic side, and also you can do coding. That's a very powerful combination. What else? I'm going to help you make combinations. I'm going to help you tell your story. I'm gonna have blue light. No, it's fine, it's a blue light, I don't know what blue means.
What made you decide to do this way of running and developing?
So I had a lot of graphic design background too. And my original thought was like, well, I can design stuff, I'm pretty artistic. I enjoy doing that. It seems like a lot of these jobs need some coding. So I'll pick up the coding again and see if maybe I can like kind of leverage, oh, well, she's a great designer, she can do a little coding too. And then I got really that into the coding. Like, I can make my own games. I don't need other people's games. I can make my own stuff. I don't need other people's apps. Right? And that kind of addicted me. Like, oh, I can do this on my own. So I think I've definitely had students come from graphic design that now do no graphic design, even though they love it and they kind of wish they could do more. And then I have some students who did no graphic design, heavily engineering, and now do a lot of graphic design. So tech is a weird field. It's kind of Wild West. It just ebbs and flows, and you don't really know where you're going to be the next day. So just kind of, I think one of my biggest pieces of advice I'm going to give you is go with the flow and don't box yourself into one thing. Kind of like you were saying, well, is it okay to know use different texts? Don't box yourself in.
You creating your own app, did you have to learn any backend or?
Oh, yeah. I did. Now I've definitely done apps without like I've cheated on the back end a little bit because there's kind of cool services out there where I've had a friend do it, but I also ended up teaching myself Node and sort of the mean stack at the time. So I enjoy the back ends. It's not my favorite. Have any of you done any back end at all? Maybe Daisy's like a back end expert.
Most of the people in this class have done JavaScript and not as much backend. There's a
Sure.
few people who are coming from the Ruby side as well.
Nice, so Ruby's a fun language, beautiful, clean. Coming from JavaScript, I'm usually really sad I didn't do Ruby first. It's just so clean. It's so beautiful. Like reading. What's your least favorite part of JavaScript? I know you've got these favorite parts. What'd you say?
I'm thinking.
Oh, there's just so many, right? JavaScript, I have gone through a passionate love-hate affair with JavaScript over time. Loved it, started really getting into it, hated it, like, oh, semicolons. ES6 came along and it's been a little gentler. But if you can really get comfortable with JavaScript, you're going to do fine in your career. No matter what I've interviewed for, that's like the number one thing it seems like they look for. And even some of my back-end students, they were like, but how comfortable are you with JavaScript? So just accept the JavaScript, let it into your heart, you'll be fine.
JavaScript, it's changing a lot as well lately.
Yes. So,
So when I started trying to learn JavaScript, it was still 2015.
Yeah.
ES6 was really, really new still,
yeah,
2 years ago.
yeah.
So then kind of like keep learning JavaScript, and then ES6 comes along, it's like, why did I learn this? ES6
Yeah.
fixes everything behind it.
Right.
But it's good to learn what it was before ES6 because that's what's behind ES6.
Right.
I mean, it's good to learn ES5. See, it's so confusing.
Exactly. I was like, it's not even really called JavaScript. That's like its nickname.
Yeah.
You know, it's called ECMAScript. It's not as catchy.
And when ES6 comes along, there's all these promises thing, and then ES7 has a new thing that fixes that problem with a bunch of promises, things like that.
Yeah.
It's a little overwhelming as well,
It
but
is.
it's going in a good path, I think.
Yeah.
Because it's fixing a lot of the stuff on the old JavaScript.
Yeah.
That used to be a nightmare.
I agree. I do think it's going on a good path. I also think it's really overwhelming, especially if you're doing the front end. We are a very scattered community. We don't really have, like, we're not solely behind one tool, right? Everyone's got an opinion. Again, try not to get overwhelmed by it. Just think, all right, I'm going to check out the new ES later. Right now, I'm concentrating on this. This is what I need for this project. There will always be time. And again, it probably has had 5 updates since the time I started this. Like, it's wild. You need to get started?
No, I'm good. Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
So I know I still deal with this, and I've been coding, for a long time now. Do you ever still have times where you just have like imposter syndrome
Oh,
type
right.
stuff, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have no idea what I'm doing.
Yes.
Everyone else knows what's going on.
Every day, yes.
I'm lost. I don't belong here.
Yes, one of my mentors he graduated from Stanford. This man is one of the smartest men I've ever met in my life. And I said to him, I just don't think I'm any good. Like every day, I feel like I can't do this, and that people just think I could. And he looked at me square in the face and said, I feel like that every day. And the man graduated from Stanford. Like, you know, this is one of the most qualified engineers I've ever met. And it was like, oh, okay. So we all kind of feel that way. All right. It is so overwhelming though. And especially for a teacher, when you get up in front of students and you ask these really unique questions. I don't know if you've experienced this, but they ask like really good questions that maybe you haven't thought about before with the tech, and you're like, I don't know why we do that. You know, so have some compassion because we can't think of every outcome. But yeah, it is every day still. I definitely feel it. I tell people I'm going to IBM on the Watson team, and I'm like, where are they going to figure out how to do this? For sure. The thing to kind of remember is you've got a lot of people in this field that are rooting for you and supporting you. And you know, you've got this network right here you're building. You've got people like Daisy who are connected all across this community, can connect you with more people, lean on each other, and just kind of touch base with each other. If you're feeling down one day, be like, hey man, remember, I'm feeling like I can't do this. And let your other classmates be like, me too, but we got this. And then be there for them when they need it. Yeah, definitely a team sport. All right, maybe.
Any other questions?
Well, it's really great to meet you all. Thank you for letting me come.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Have
thanks for
fun.
coming here. Awesome. That's great. Oh, I don't know what I'm going to tell these guys anyways. I'm just going to make it up.
Do that.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Let's share my screen. Let's go down the rabbit hole. And somebody else. Someone else made it sound like that too, right? All right. Before we dive into this, we should probably do our stand-up, right? Give people a chance to talk about where they're at.
In the circle,
Yeah,
a little bit fit.
that's part of the whole thing. Get out of your comfort
See, he
zone.
really commits to it. You got to come up here and stand up. Look at how lazy I was with you guys last time.
Yeah, there's a lot of videos about people like they put out like bad versions of stand-ups, and they have people like just sitting back and typing while the meeting's going on, and it's just like they're not focused, and you know that's kind of like not the point of it, right? So this way, all your distractions are pushed to the side, and you can kind of focus and you know only on what you what you have accomplished and what you want to accomplish, and not go into a big discussion at that point, but maybe be a springboard to a future conversation, things like that. So, go ahead, Morgan.
Okay, so I finished, well, they don't go by chapters, but I finished reading section 2, not too advanced with this. I was out this weekend, so I wasn't able to do a lot of coding. I was able to, I was actually trying to update my, just for fun, I was trying to update my repo on my project to Webpack 3 and React 16, just for fun, but I had a lot of problems in it. But other than that, yeah, I'm still going through the tutorial, trying to really learn what is really going on. Yeah. What's the next thing? Oh, yeah, so that's it.
Next chapter.
Oh yeah, so yeah, next what is
Editing
happening?
notes, or I don't know which one you're on.
Yeah, so I gave up on the whole upgrading. Like you were saying, stick with what's working. It gave me a lot of headaches. Yeah, I'm back to what it was now. I'm not gonna try to upgrade for now. So I'm going back to the Braille again. Yeah, other than that, yeah, there's no obstacles for this week, so I should get advanced.
Awesome. So since last class, I finished the editing note section and styling, and I started reading ahead to integrating Flux and connecting it to those services. I've only scratched the surface on that, but like Jorge said, I'm going back through and just polishing up things that still don't make a lot of sense to really make sure I understand for future projects.
So I started deleting notes and there is some piece of code that I didn't understand at all, so I just kind of left it alone. And I started doing the Code Academy for React. And just kind of going back to JavaScript with the one project. I really haven't really been feeling good, so I haven't been.
I'm on the adding notes part. True is that I didn't practice much these days, so I was doing college stuff. But yeah, I'm just waiting to this lesson to be able to the lesson.
Is there anything blocking you other than time?
Well, not too much really. As everybody is saying, I'm just trying to figure out how everything is working and trying to find how really I can create the bigger picture in my mind. Because like I say, we are just copy and paste it, but now we are breaking down the parts.
Yeah, that's the
So
best
that's
thing.
the best way to understand it for us. And we don't have to make knowledge. We don't feel comfortable with JavaScript tools. We're like trying to understand everything at the same time. And the last class I was talking to her, we were thinking like we should set a project to create something to start at the very beginning. Setting up the HTML and CSS, but creating one project for everyone. There's a I don't know, for example, there's a company, multiple company who needs a web page for whatever. We should create something like that. Maybe that make us understand better how this all works. So let's see.
Instructor feedback?
Yeah.
Hi everyone. Yes, on Saturday I had a short conversation with Jared. He helped me to see things and Randall. So when I got home, I stopped over in the tutorial. So I had the same mistake. Sometimes I stop, sometimes the mistake in front of me, I can see it. When like as Jared just showed me something, it was in front of me and I can see it. I don't know if because I'm too focused and I study too much and sometimes, but what step by what just to say I would really better if we can start to do something like a short a project and we can understand better what we try to learn. But I think now I'm getting better with some help with Jared and Mendel, so it's good.
at the notes and stuff of the previous class and just following along with what we're talking about on Tuesday, so you try to go from there in regards to like how it works and how does everything work. Yeah, I actually did go academy too, with React and stuff. And I really need to go back to HTML and like brush up on this along with JavaScript, so I can really figure out what's going on. Because like nested structure for HTML and JavaScript being together, it was just like really throwing me off. I was like, I might need to go back to CSS too. Just brush up and see what I need to work on in regards to like setting up the structure and stuff. Because when I was doing some like exercises, I was getting frustrated at how they want you to do it, and they want really big spaces between code and stuff. It was just a whole bunch of stuff that I was just trying to go back and brush up.
I guess we are complicated, so you have to kind of go back to the transcript. So that's what I was doing.
Yeah, right. But it definitely actually helps that like be able to have hands-on experience actually rewriting code and stuff, and they actually use examples. That's for me personally. That's why I use that after I use that. Okay.
Is there any technical stuff that you're,
Um,
other than just getting up to speed on it, blocking or?
I would say time is so many things that I'm doing. So I would just say those two. Set up stuff on the same type of side like I did before. Trying to like set an hour or so or 2 hours every day. And just code.
So far, I completed the leading section, the leading up section. I got a little confused, so I was telling Jared about bonds and props. I have somewhat of an idea about props, but that and what keeps messing me up is semicolons and the semicolons in the parentheses. Sometimes I'll miss something.
Yeah, if it's curly or.
Just whilst we paying more attention. Some of the stuff I get stuck on when I actually stop, and then I'll just start to move just to get a better understanding of it. And I'm also working on another tutorial at the same time, just to get an idea, to see if there are things. So I was messing around with something called Yarn.
Okay.
Nothing's really blocking me right now, so it's just time and just getting a better understanding of some stuff.
I've been working on React JavaScript for the Academy along with original class. Finished the last section that we were working on, just trying to understand it fully. But I'm really struggling to understand it, and some parts I'm like, I don't know where I'm struggling, so I don't know what.
You mean with the class tutorial or just React in general or?
The class for it.
Okay.
But sometimes when I practice React on Code Academy, some things start to make more sense about why we did certain things. But then it's hard to practice those things because we've already moved forward from it. We've already built on it. So that understand.
So far, I've only read a little bit of the React and Flux part, but when I was reading it, it was pretty abstract to me, all of it. So I kind of just like let it go a little bit, went back to what we were working on, and still trying to like sort of figure out how a lot of the things connect in some ways, or like the app and the notes sometimes. But for the most part, it's really just like trying to like find different examples of like ways that I can use props, like components, so that I can kind of get like more ingrained with it, and so I can kind of understand the concepts better, you know. But I don't think anything is blocking me right now.
Okay.
So since last time I was able to get to the middle of editing notes. By next time, I hope to be done with that.
one. The only thing blocking me is after last class, I've been doing a lot, I've been able to finish up to the stylizing the note application part. And after I was done with that, I just started messing around with it, started thinking about my own stuff, wanted like, really change the color and stuff. And, not really much blocking me at the moment. The one thing I hope to accomplish is like some of the other stuff that might be up for React like later on. I only read like a couple part, like the next one after the notes part, but I didn't read that much. So I just took up with what I was doing like so far.
Okay, great. That's very good feedback. Thank you, everybody.
So there's a quick thing, there's a thing, at Code School, if anyone has seen Code School before, they're having a free weekend camp. So you can sign up and all the classes are available this weekend. If you have time, I think it will be good. I'll send you guys a link in the Slack.
So for anyone who's also not here, you can have a chance to chime in on this, but I'm definitely hearing, it's like we talked about, there's definitely a ramp up in complexity for what we're doing here. There's a lot we're sort of putting together. And so the idea sounded a little bit like, might be moving a little fast for some people through this tutorial. Maybe we can take it a little slower and add in some other examples, or even weave in some basic JavaScript stuff again to reemphasize some of those skills. The question I would want to ask, and anyone who doesn't feel comfortable speaking up here, you can let me know or something, is I don't want people to feel like there's no end, or they feel like they signed up for a specific set time frame, like, oh, we're going to be done in 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and then something's extending out. But if people are fine with sort of having class continue on much longer and keep building that, we can spend a little bit more time focusing on sort of these reiterating these concepts, doing some more JavaScript stuff, or even bringing in some other React examples that maybe we work through as a class, or we give you to work on and build up. That might be more just another way to practice those skills. That would definitely probably extend the time that it'll take until we're done with, say, the tutorial or something like that. But if people think that'll be a lot better for you in terms of picking stuff up, and you're okay with that sort of plan where it may shift our time frame on some of this stuff a little bit, I'm fine with that. I don't have a I have to be done with this class at a certain date myself, right? I just want to make sure that nobody else feels like they signed up to a certain date, they want to be done with the tutorial by that date, and then they're feeling like, oh man, we're not going to reach it at that point in time. So if people are interested in that, you can let me know on Slack, or if you feel like you really want us to try and finish the tutorial by a certain date, probably let me know that more, so that, because that'll way more. But if I don't hear otherwise, I'll try and spend some more time going over some of the basic JavaScript and some other examples of some React apps or things like that in class, which might slow it down a little bit, but hopefully give you more practice. Yeah.
Yeah. Before we said something, I'm talking for myself. I said before, I would like we start to do something like, okay, we started to build something. But for myself, I think the way you go with the class is good, because I have more knowledge now. Even though I don't know how to put everything together to do something, but I think it's good the way the class working, the class, okay? So I give myself some time to better understand everything, and after I can build something together, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to change anything for myself. I'm talking for myself, okay? Because I'm glad the way you teach the class, okay? Because now, sometimes I get up in the morning and I say, oh, I have so much knowledge in my head, and And sometimes I said, oh, I don't know anything.
Yeah.
But it's a good feeling. Okay?
Okay.
It's a good feeling because when I'm thinking, I know things. I know a lot of things.
Right.
So let's continue like that.
Okay.
One thing I can say is sometimes in class and even going to tutorials, like you touch on it in class now, they still have no idea. So then I'll just take a note and I'll go look it up later on.
Yeah.
And then after I see it a different way, I'll understand it. I can actually, my mind go back and say, oh, that's what he was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, let me know if that's the case too. I'm happy to go over a topic again and come at it from different angles.
I just know you have to see the same thing.
That's what I do too. You know, that's why part of what I do is sometimes like, oh, they showed you this, and I can break it down in a different way or something.
Yeah, I mean, another thing, that was my class on the Rails class. And there were some things when we were all going over a tutorial similar to this, there's Rails that we wouldn't know what was going on, right? And I mean, I feel like it's okay if you don't understand everything once we finish here, because you'll see it again, and then you'll probably get it again. So
Right.
just by finishing this tutorial, you won't be able to just make another application by scratch again. Because I know, at least when I did the Rails tutorial, it was similar to this. There were some things that even if Ramiro, the other instructor, even if he was going over it again, I would kind of understand that it wasn't really making sense. When we were actually working on projects, when we were working on the real projects that we worked on, when I was trying to build it, I wasn't really, I didn't know what was going on a little bit. But then you'll actually build something and it's like, oh, that actually makes sense out of nowhere. So again, I don't think you should focus on thinking that once we do this, you have to know everything that React has. There's a lot of holes that are gonna be there that later on you're probably gonna learn. Yeah, so.
Right.
I say too, even after this, it's time to actually work on something real. You're gonna always feel like but you actually start working on stuff. You have no choice but to learn after. So a lot of stuff, because after the last tutorial, time to do that. As I started working on it and I got stuck, I would have no choice but to look it up and figure out what's going on. It happens again. Some of the same peers you'll hit it one time, and after you teach yourself what's going on, you'll see it again. You're gonna always feel to a point that you don't know everything. Yeah. With that being said, you'll teach yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's good. I wasn't joking when I say, you know, I mean, I've been a software developer for a good while now, and I still have like, I look at code and I just dive into something and I'm like, I know nothing. I'm not cut out for this. I can't write that amount of code that that person produced in that period of time. I'm never going to do this, you know? Oh my gosh. I'm intimidated. I don't understand this at all, right? Like I was at a conference recently and I went to a talk on a topic and I was like, oh, I'm all excited to learn about this topic. And I walked out of it and I was like, I don't understand anything that he said. It didn't make any sense whatsoever. Like, and that happens sometimes, you know, stuff can take quite a while to kick in. I had a whole class in college that was focused on functional programming, and I didn't understand what I was doing that entire class, like a whole semester. And I just had no clue. I just random trial and error got me through. And then I had a class like year and a half later or whatever on the same topic, and in between there, it had clicked, and I'm just like, oh, this is all easy. I'm done. Like, this doesn't take me any time at all. So there can be sort of those moments as you're learning a lot of this.
The trick I learned about React, the way I have to learn it is by thinking about something. So I look at React like a piece. So each topic is like small components of pieces. And that's how it's like React's going, like it's small parts that we're going to do. So I just think of like metaphors that helps me understand it like easier. But breaking it down like puzzle pieces, giant puzzle with ultimate. It helps out just thinking about it.
you watch videos?
Yeah, I was gonna post it. But it's one of the two. But it's just a lot of times it's different people explaining the same.
Right.
Like, I had to look at
And if you guys have questions about specific topics, like, man, I'm really stuck on this topic, it's not making sense to me, ask, because I try not to just post like, here's a huge pile of resources to learn about different topics or different ideas. But on a lot of these different topics, I have some resources. So if somebody's struggling with one topic, I can put something out there to say, oh, try this perspective. Like, I know we're not there yet, but a good example is when you start to get into flux and stuff, I found it really useful. This Lynn Clark did these great like cartoon, or comic type helpful tools to help you try and understand what's going on or what flux is intended to do. So there's there's a lot of different tools for different problems you're going to encounter, ways to try and learn it or ways to think about it in different ways. And so ask about it, because somebody else may have said, oh man, I was stuck on, bind on functions too. And I read this article and it made so much sense to me. I understand what's going on now. Sort of the best way to grow is to help each other out.
I had one question, I guess. Sounds like the feedback that I heard from a couple people were that, starting your own little project would be helpful to kind of get your head around versus like copy and paste all the time. And one thing I'm kind of wondering is, okay, you've all done a few of these chapters now. So let's say like, one of the chapters was at the beginning was implementing a node application for just adding a node in here. What if we put in a little stretch goal that, pretty easy, where it's something like, okay, you're inserting a node, but add the current time along with that. Like when you add in a node, you'll have the text, but then, the time, whatever time you actually press the button, something like that. Just don't tell you how to do it, and then the next class, just kind of see people, how they approach that problem, because everybody will come up with a different solution probably. So, but then everybody also said they don't have time either, so maybe that's too burdensome. But would that be helpful to do something like that, or is that just too much extra work to put on there? I don't know.
That's a good idea.
Okay, so that's something, I can work with Jared and just suggest a couple like really easy add-ons or something.
Yeah.
Like that to some of these.
I think that'd be great.
Okay, cool.
No, this is the class. Sometimes it's just talking about stuff, right? I don't know if we're going to work through something entirely. Now, I do have at least one topic that I suspect some people were stuck with in this chapter that would be useful to talk about. But I think basically what we want to go over is some of the deleting notes stuff today. So who's made it, again, like at least to this chapter and started working on deleting notes or is past it at this point? All right, decent number. So before I just dive in, I think it's more useful if we talk on the topics that people had challenges with. So is there anything immediately that people had a challenge with or didn't understand starting off in this chapter? I know that there's some topics, so I know we'll get to bind at least, but props?
Maybe talk about it last.
Okay, what about props?
Just I understand a prop is, it's like giving, props is like calling something that has like a functionality behind it, right? I'm trying to understand how we apply props to the app.
Props to the app.
Is it just like a template or something that's constantly changing? Or how
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about this a little bit. This is really more about React, right? So let's look at just JavaScript objects again, right? Let's step out of anything specific. and or anything tied more to the app, I guess. And let's talk about JavaScript objects. So if we have just a JavaScript object, you know, let's do hero again. Then we can add properties to this object, and those we just give them a name, which is our key, and then a value for the property, right? So it has a name. Does anybody have a hero they want that's different than the ones we've used before? Wonder Woman. Oh, I like Black Panther too. We'll have another one. And then I don't even remember what her real name is. Diana of like Themyscira or something weird, right? We could do like I don't know, what's another property of a Wonder Woman or hero?
I guess
Her abilities. So let's do that. Let's make abilities an object on our hero. And we're going to add, so now we have hero, if we look at it, we've got name, real name, and abilities, which is another object. So we can do hero.abilities dot, and this can be, you know, whatever we want them to be, like different ones. Strength, you know, equals, you know, on a scale of like 1 to 100, it's like, I don't know, like 100, just ridiculously strong, right? And can fly equals true. I don't know. What? I don't know. She's able to fly by the end of that movie. That's all I know. At the end of that movie, she's flying. Don't ask me. Like, you know, and you could have other ones, right? So I like this because the props on React, all React is doing is creating a special property on an object that it calls props. So here we have a hero, which has a few properties. It has like a name, real name, and then we could call this a special property, abilities, which is just an object, which is just more another set of key value properties, right? So in React, React's objects that it creates are doing the same thing, except let's act like we're creating a component here, right? And a React component has certain things that are part of it as well. So it has a name, which might be note for one of the components, right? And the component has a render method, which is a function of some kind that returns a value. And a React component has a props value, which is just another object, really. And then that can have different properties on it. Like in this case, our note might have an ID, you know, and because I don't want to do a GUID, I'll just give it a numeric ID. And it might have a, I don't know, what else would it have? It could have a message or text. Right, now in this case, I'm going to change my render function in just a minute to use this, but so it could have text, right? So now let's take a look at our object that we have here that we've created. It's got a name, it's got some render method, and then it just has a props object, which are just certain properties on it. That's really all the props are on a React object. It's just another object that's passed in that you can then reference the values off of.
So it's props an object that holds values.
Yeah, it's an object just like this would be or whatever. It's just key value pairs. Yep. What's that? The object has a property, which is an object. Yeah. Another object, which is just, you know, your keys and values for your props, right? And so now let me change this render on here because I want it to, I mean, I could call this right now, component.render, right? This is a note. But let's say I want that render to use my props from my thing, right? So I'll do component.render equals function. And now I want to return the value of the text instead. And since this is a method on my object, how do I get a reference to my own object inside of it? This dot, and do text directly, props dot text, right? Now if I called component.render, let's pick up groceries. That's really all that's going on with the props in a React component, and that's all that's going on with the render function. It's just a JavaScript object like this, and it just renders out the result of calling the render method. There's not much more magic behind the scenes going on. The only difference where it does have a difference is React locks those props so you can't change them on your components. You have to create a new, essentially you have to call it again with the props in order to have changed them. So you're almost recreating your React component every time, in a sense. And that's the only real difference between props. And that's why React has the two ideas of props and state. Props is something that you can't really change without basically recreating your component. Oh, I need to change my props. Well, those just got passed in. Those aren't something I can mutate and have it change. So I can't do that. State is something you can change without regenerating your component. It's like a constant, yeah. So you can't change the values without messing something up. Yeah. But with state, yeah, I mean, we could do it the same way. So I can add state to this right now, right? So let's say that this this component, we want to add some state also. All right, so we just added, so now if we look at our component, it has a name, it has render, it has props, it has state, but the state has nothing in it. It's just another object, really. And then, so now let's say we want to add some state to it. So component dot state dot is complete equals false, right? And so let's go ahead and change our render because we want our render to tell us whether or not, tell us what the task is or whatever, the note, and tell us whether we've completed it, right? So that should be pretty simple. Anybody want to take a stab at writing this function? Let's say we want to, here, let me give you some wording. Let's say we want it to say is task, like task, then the task name or whatever, what you want it to be, and and then followed by is complete, true or false. Call it text. We're just doing some string concatenation, so I'm going to use this ES6 feature of being able to inline some of this. I'm going to say task, then get this out. Task blah is completed. I don't know. I can put my this dot state dot is complete, right? And now I can sort of. No, this is just me being lazy. ES6 added the ability to do what's called string templates. So I'll write this out a different way that might be easier for people who weren't in our other class or whatever. But this lets me reference the variables directly inside of this string. So this is very close to like a Ruby string template where you can use variable names. If I were to do this without that, I would have to write it like this. Task colon, and then I need to concatenate this dot props dot text, right? And then I need to concatenate like is completed, and now I can add this dot state dot is completed. And what I should really do here to make sure that I'm doing this right is like toString probably, so that I'm not doing some sort of implicit coercion to a string. I'm explicitly saying like take this Boolean value and make it a string, which I think should work. So then we wrote this just a little more complex function, right? Component.render. Cannot read toString undefined. All right, fine. I didn't like it. Oh, is complete, right? I didn't call it is completed. I think it's is complete. Oh, my cursor isn't in the right place, or something's not right. I don't know. All right, let's try it now. Whoa, I don't even know what's going on. All right. Now the difference between props and state on a React component, and really the only difference, is that, well, I mean, there's more, but the key aspect is that you can change your state, and it should change that component and change how it renders. So if we change the state on this, like this dot state dot is complete equals true. Oh, this. I can't do this in here, right? I'm not in the component right now. Component.state.is complete equals true. And now if I tried to render, it would tell me it's true. Whereas if I tried to change, now I could change the props on this right now. But if I tried to change them on a React component, it wouldn't cause it to re-render. It wouldn't know that I'd changed those props. It can't do anything with changed props. It treats that as an immutable object, something that you can't change or do anything with once they've been passed in. So that's really the only difference. So if I tried to change the task prop text from pick up groceries to something else, you wouldn't see that change. What you need to do is recreate that, and the way you recreate that is by whatever called it. So like the notes here creates the note. You need to create it again. You can imagine each one of these, each time it goes through this render and has this note line here, that's like it's creating a note object and setting these properties on it. And each one of those is like, oh, this is a new note object with new properties on it. That's essentially the way it acts. There's a little bit more behind the scenes, but that's really like how you can think about it. Does that make sense? Difference between two? Yeah.
One of the prompts, there's some other later in the code is props.
That has nothing to do with props. That's something that's not even properly supported by JavaScript yet. So that, you know, it's probably not good for them to be showing that. It's I don't know. I'll show that when we get there for the whole class. But it's what's known as object spread syntax. And so it's a JavaScript feature or trying to be standardized into the language. And it's a way to be really lazy, essentially. Because let's say, I can explain it maybe just really quickly. So let's say we do have, our hero object, right? Name, real name, abilities, etc. And so if we were writing a bit of like React code or a React component that took in this hero and we wanted to render it, so let's say we had that. Now I can't really do it, so I'm going to, you know, just do some sort of string here that looks like it instead. But a hero component, and so we'll say I'm in some list where I'm outputting heroes or whatever, right? And so for each one of them, I want to show the hero component, and I want to pass in some properties of it so that it'll render those. I want to give it a name, so I can say that is like hero.name. And I want to pass in the real name, and you know, that can be hero.real name. And I want to pass in abilities, and so I can do hero.abilities, right? And that's a little verbose if I know that everything on this object I want to pass in as properties onto my hero or whatever. So there's that's what that spread syntax is for. It's a really lazy man's syntax, essentially, where what you're saying is like, oh, hero. And what that's going to do is essentially convert that code into the code right above. It's going to say, take every property on this hero object and spread it into this piece by piece as a property for this. It's lazy. It probably shouldn't be done in a tutorial like this because it's a piece of code that sort of hides what you're really trying to do as opposed to showing your intention. It's hiding the intention behind the code.
Good question. I've seen that as well. So how does it know to name? You just depending on the property volume.
How does it know what?
How does it know how to name it? Like on the top, you have name equals hero.
Name.
And on the bottom, you just have hero. How does it know? Does it name it according to?
What it actually does, like behind the scenes or whatever, what it does is it iterates over all of the properties of that object and splits them out into properties going into the JSX. So it does something like this. Hero dot object dot own property names of hero. So this is a method built into the object, like object or whatever. And you can see what it did was it got the name, the real name, the abilities, because those are the properties of my hero. So essentially this is what's going on with that little dot, 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 is it does this. And then it says, okay, now create hero name equals hero.name, hero real name equals, because this same value is used both here and here, right? Here and here, here and here. So it can programmatically do that for you, but it's sort of hiding the intention of what you're doing. And sometimes when you write code like that, I've written React code like that, and I'm actually switching over to being more explicit most of the time, because you may pass properties down that you didn't really want to. Like, I'm just passing everything through. A lot of times it's better if you know exactly what you intend to pass through. That make sense, Rondell, a little bit on
Yeah, it
props?
makes more sense now that you see it, kind of like, you know, props have objects.
Right, yep. Props is just an object on your React object, or your component, right? It's just a special object that React, you know, creates for you. The only special part about it is React creates that for you off of the items that you pass in, right? The attributes that you set. So if this was HTML, as opposed to, you know, a React component, if this was an HTML element, like let's add one. This li list item is an example, but let's have another one. You know, if we had a div, you can set some attributes on an HTML element, your ID, you know, and you can set other attributes if you want, class. And really, you can set any attributes that you want to. And so all of those are just properties of this div. And all React does for props is when you're instantiating a React component, like this note, it takes each one of the attributes that you pass to it, just like an HTML attribute, and adds those to the props object. It's just, yeah, it's just making those your props for your props object. Yep. All right, any other, like I said, I'll try and get to the bind, we'll see. Any other topics that were confusing in this chapter as well? Yeah?
Further down, it says communicating with deletion to
Yes.
the concept of the E.
Uh-huh.
Events.
Okay. Yeah, we haven't talked a lot about what goes on with browser events in this class. But let me try and find a good way to show this. Let's see here. This should work just fine. So the DOM has events that can fire on on elements, right? And we've talked a little bit about that. So you have things like, let me look, like HTML element click. Like this is a method simulates a mouse click. Not what I'm looking for. Here we go. The click event. These are the DOM like events. So these are things that exist, DOM being your browser essentially. And there's a whole bunch of different types of events that can fire in your browser when things happen. So we talked a little bit about it before, but not a ton, where you can have things like, let me inspect this guy so I have access to him, that span, and then I'm going to say on him, I'm going to add an event listener for the click event. And what I want it to do, I'm going to use this newer method format. I'm going to say EBT, just to give it, I can't say event because that sort of messes with the DOM. The DOM event is like can be a special word, and so it's better to use a different one so you don't confuse that. And then I'm going to console.log that, just, all right. So now, when I clicked on that guy, what happened is I've added a bit of code to my browser essentially that says, this is an event listener. When a click event happens, call this method with all of the information about that click that you have, right? So this is, when a click happens, call this function and pass in all the information about that click. And all that information is just an object. Just like any other JavaScript object, it's a mouse event object. And this is all the information that exists when you click something with the mouse in your browser that you could do something with. So that's a lot of different event information, right? There's a lot of things going on there. I don't know what all this does. I know what some of it does. Like some of it's telling you you were at position 62 and 72 inside of your browser window when you clicked. So that's roughly 62 pixels from the, the left and 72 from the top. And then there's some other, a lot of other information in here as well. And on your screen, so that's talking about, this browser window or whatever, 62 and 72. But on the screen, which means this whole thing, I was 135 pixels from the left because it's way over here, and 146 from the top. So there's all this information that's contained there. And that's what that event is all the information about the event that just happened. So if I move over a little bit, we can see that my X and Y values are changing, and they're different for each one of those clicks. But that's only happening on this object because that's what I registered it on. So if I'm clicking up here, I'm not firing my events. I'm clicking over here, it's not happening. And there's a lot of different types of events you can hook up to. So, the click is one of the most common ones. Let me see if this shows all the other ones real fast. No, this is just showing. Oh yeah, here's all of the different events, or a large chunk of them over here on the left side here, that you can hook into in your browser. And some of these are on different elements and some aren't. So you can look at a double click. You can fire an event on a double click. You can fire an event on when somebody presses a key down, you can capture that and know what key they pressed. Key press, which means something a little different on each platform. It might mean the key down and up or something like that. You can look at just when the key comes up. You can look at mouse down. So did they press down on it, but they haven't released yet or whatever? Are they scrolling when the window resizes? There's a lot of different events that you can hook into in the browser on your elements. And each one of them, a lot of them have a lot of the same information, but they may have something that's a little different and unique between each one of them. So that's what that E is. In scroll down here. Went too far. Where is it? He's talking about it right here. Hold on. Oh, right. All the way in the app it is. So this delete note item, it's getting the ID and then the event. That's what this E is here, is the event. This, yeah, you can give it any name you want, right? Because it's just like any other parameter in a function, right? Is something can pass in values, but you get to choose the names of the items inside of your function. You're not bound to anything external outside of it. Does that make a little bit of sense? I mean, there's a lot behind the idea of an event object. And you can see he does something with it here too, which we probably won't talk too much about right now, but not only do you get this object, but you can even set some properties on it that change the way that your browser handles that event going forward. We'll talk about that probably just when we may have a larger discussion on how a browser handles events, because I don't think we talked much about that in the last class. But it's a useful thing to know. And that's sort of what that stop propagation is dealing with the larger idea of browser handling events. Any other questions right now?
So Jared, this might be jumping into the mind question, but before that part, in that section where they're talking about app/component/notes.jsx.
Uh-huh.
In the declaration statement, they were actually putting in a function for on delete. It's a little, sorry, it's a little bit down.
Hold on. Oh, yeah.
Right there.
Right here.
Yeah,
Ah,
yeah.
again, he's using a lot of these newer features of JavaScript, right? And this is really a cool feature, but it's also putting a lot of bits together. So let's step back and talk about what's going on with that. He's talking about this line here where, this is sort of our component, and here is our function signature. And what it expects is an object as its first parameter. And on that object, it uses this destructuring notation to get the notes property and an onDelete property off of it. So just to review that destructuring, which is a little odd or whatever, if we have this hero object and then we want to get a couple of the properties off that and put them into variables with the same names as those properties, we can do a little bit of a shorthand. So we could say name and real name equals hero. And that will have given us a name object and a name variable and a real name variable, and essentially mapped those to the property names inside of your object. So it's a little bit of a shorthand. If we had written that out differently, we could have done it more like var name equals hero.name, and then the same for real name. So it's just a little bit of a shorthand. But another thing that you can do, that's set destructuring bit. So that deals with that. Another nice aspect that was added in JavaScript, ECMAScript 6, is the ability to have default values for variables and functions. So if we were to define function add, and this has two numbers, right? num1, it expects two numbers, and num2. And this is going to return num1 plus num2. What happens if I call add with 1 and 2? What's the result? 3, right? And what if I call it with just 1? Not a number. And that's because it's looking for both of these values. num2 is undefined inside of this invocation of add, right? So if we add 1 plus undefined, we get not a number back. But what if we want it to go ahead and work and just not air out? The way we would do that traditionally in JavaScript is we might do something like this: num1, num2. All right, now we can say if num, and I'll just assume num2 is the only one that could be undefined. It would be weird to call it with nothing. So let's say if num2 equals undefined, then, oops, I didn't use shift. All right, hold on. Then num2 equals 0. And now let's just return num1 plus num2 and end my function. So basically what I'm doing is giving it a default value, right? Saying, oh, if I didn't get a value for this, just give it 0 instead. So now if I called add, all right, hold on. Didn't like my attempts to tab up. All right. Now if I call add 1 and 2, I should still get 3. If I call add with just 1, I should just get 1 back because it set number 2 is 0 and 1 plus 0 is 1, right? That's the traditional way to do a default variable in JavaScript because we didn't have a nice syntax for it. But ES6 gives us a really nice new syntax for this where you can say num1, num2 equals 0. And then you can return num1 plus num2. And now if I call add with 1 and 2, I should get 3. But if I call it with just 1, I should still get 1 because it's looking and saying, oh, you didn't give me a value, this is undefined, then assign 0 to it, is what it's saying. If I didn't have something for this, if it's undefined, somebody didn't pass a value in, give it the value of 0. So it's just a shorthand. All of that other code I had, that little if block at the top, this replaced that. And it did it very concisely. Yes? It can. I didn't do that for a couple reasons. So it does if we wrote it like this, right? So then let's say we call add without anything, we get back 0 because both of them don't have a value. Now, let me ask you a question though. What would happen in this case if I didn't pass in any values to it? If I change my, you notice I just changed it. So only num1 has a default value and num2 here doesn't. What? It'll be not a number. And that's because this doesn't have a default value, but this does. So this can get 0, but this doesn't get a default value. So it's sort of coincidence of the fact that when you use default values, it doesn't make sense to have default values for any parameters before your first default, like before like the last one and going forward. So if, let's say now we change this and I don't know, it took 3 different numbers and it added them up. If I had, it wouldn't make sense for this to have a default value without giving a default value to the last one as well, unless I didn't care about that last parameter, because I would still have something that doesn't have a valid value, right? So if I have a default here though, okay, well now it might make sense to also have one here and maybe here also. But for example, that wouldn't make sense. Again, because yeah, the first one could be 0, the last one could be 0, but the middle one's still undefined. That's not going to work exactly the way you want. So what pretty much typically happens is anything that you want default values for, you usually put at the end of your parameters for your function or whatever, your arguments. Does that make sense? So yeah, you can give default values for everything in it and call it, like I did there, add with nothing, and it just sort of works because it just sets them to whatever the default is. So that's what's going on with this on delete here, except it's giving it a default function that does nothing. This is essentially just a no-op function. It's a function that takes no parameters and returns undefined or nothing, right? So it's just saying, make sure on delete is a function of some kind, but it's okay if it's a function that does nothing. Just make sure it at least is a function. Is essentially what this little bit of code is doing here. Yeah, no, it's a good catch. I didn't even notice that.
Can throw you off just because we're already using the function outside of the JSX.
Right. Yeah. Again, I think that they're too dense in their syntax here. I think it's much better if we break this stuff out more. But I brought my code back to this just so that it looks like this. So if I want to, you know, reverse it again, I can pull it back out step by step to show you guys. The next thing that we'll talk about, and we'll probably need to talk about this in more detail later, is what's going on with this weird onDelete .bind bit of code here, right? So this is some super weird magic stuff. This is doing something magic. So it gets into a little bit of JavaScript and object references in this, although in this case it doesn't really tie into that. The person is doing it more as a lazy man's way to have a default or to have a value already passed in. So I'm going to rewrite this and show you what I think is a cleaner way to have written this, or the more standard way, which I hope makes more sense to most people. And then we'll go revisit what was going on with the bind to talk about it in that context. Because I think it's easier when you show the more straightforward approach to then go back and talk about what the bind is trying to do. So what I'm going to do here is, instead of this doing a bind and passing in this onDelete, I'm just going to pass the onDelete into my note, directly into it. So what I'm doing is just passing a method in for my onDelete property, right? Because that method came from app.jsx, which defined this delete note function, and then passes it in a reference to that function into the notes. And my notes is just going to pass that reference right on through to the notes. So all that's doing, if we were to sketch it out, is the app has a function that it's created, delete note. It's passing a reference to that function, but not calling it, just a reference to it so it could be called, to the notes. And now the notes are passing that right through as a property onto our note. So now this note has a onDelete property, which it's pulling off right here. And I'm going to make this a little more explicit again, for the sake of talking about this stuff right now. Just a moment. Let's make this all a little more explicit. So we're returning something here, and let's var task equals props task, and var onDelete equals props onDelete. I'll get rid of this bit here now. So just a little more explicit in terms of what we're doing, right? We're passing in an object, and that object has a task property and an onDelete property. onDelete just happens to be a function. And now what we want to do is, whenever the delete button is clicked in our application here, I made that big, but not my stuff over here. Let's make this bigger. When the delete button gets clicked, we want to go ahead and delete the item, right? So let's check and see if that's working now. Something's wrong. I'm pretty sure I should not be working. Oh, I didn't save my notes.jsx bit. There we go. Now I should not be working right now. So if I click this, it's going to blow up. So this is actually what happened when I was converting this over initially. So I was trying to figure out, okay, what's happened here? So let me take a minute and look at it, right? This is saying on click. When I click, then really call onDelete instead of, that's the method I should call. Okay, I think that's working the way I want. I mean, sort of. So what was my error here? It's telling me property stop propagation of undefined. So where is stop propagation being called? Let's try and trace this backwards now, right? So let's go back up the stack. So this is on delete. Well, that's a function that got passed in, and I'm calling it when I click. So where did that come from? Well, it got passed in from this notes item, right? It passed it in right here. And what is on delete in here? Well, it's either going to be this empty function call, or it got passed in as a property onto my notes. So let's look at my app and see. Sure enough, it got passed in as a property on my notes, and it's delete note. So let's keep tracing it backwards. We've got delete note now. All right. Delete note is a function, and what does delete note as a function expect? ID and an event, right? And here, oh, that looks a lot like the error I'm getting. E.stop propagation. So, and it told me it's undefined, I think. Check. Stop cannot read property stop propagation of undefined. So I think E is undefined here because it tried to call stop propagation of something that's undefined. All right, so it looks like the event isn't getting passed into this delete note function. This gets into a little bit of what he was hiding with the bind. And so you have to know a little bit about the event handlers, right? Let's go back and look at, I don't think I have it up anymore, but that event handler that we had written over here, our add event listener, right? The function that we passed in took an event parameter. How did it get that event parameter? Well, it got passed from the browser into it automatically when it got called. So the way that you hook up event handlers in when you're doing it directly on HTML or inside of React is instead of like add event listener call, you can use an on and then the event name property. So here we did click, right? So that becomes on click with the click being uppercase. And that's saying this is going to get called with the event. So essentially that means on delete is going to get called and passed in the event as its first argument. Except what is this expecting the first argument to be here? It's expecting an ID, right? So that's not going to work. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll change this. Maybe I'll expect the first thing to be the event and the next one to be the ID, and what's going to happen. All right. Let's refresh this just to make sure. And if we click, we're not getting an error now, but nothing happened. All right. Wonder why nothing's happening. Anyone know why? Okay, let's check that. So this is what I would do. I'm like, man, I think maybe like the ID isn't set, and so it's not changing my list of items correctly. So let's console.log. The ID being deleted is ID, right? So I added something into this event handler, this delete note method, so that it'll log the ID. And now I'll be able to check and see if it's doing what I expect. Let me just get rid of this. And I click this. Okay, well, that's not working. So let's try this again, refresh it. The ID being deleted is undefined. Yeah, so I'm not, okay, I'm not getting an ID. So let's go back through our code and check something here. Here we have our notes. And sure enough, we have an ID here for each note. But where is that ID being used? Well, I've already given you a partial answer here. Let me get rid of my line there. Anyone who was paying attention already has part of the answer. Where's the ID being used right now? It's just being used on the list item as a key. It's not being passed into our note. So our note doesn't even know the ID of itself, right? Well, to me, I think it makes sense. The note should have its ID. So let's pass it in as a parameter to the note as well, right? So now it's going to have an ID property. So now that we've passed that down into the note, now inside of here, we can change this code a little bit. So instead of just directly calling onDelete, let's create a function instead that we want to do this. We want to call onDelete. So we'll create one right here. Our, handle click. I'm going to use this newer notation or whatever. And this function gets called on the onClick. So we know that it's going to get the event passed into it from the browser, right? And what do we want to actually do when they click is we want to call down into this onDelete function, but we want to call that with the correct signature. Let me switch these back around just for the sake of keeping it the same as the tutorial. So we want to call onDelete, and onDelete expects 2 arguments, ID and the event, right? So we can pass in the ID and the event, which we could have just called E here too. Didn't matter. ID is not defined. Oh, it's yelling at me because ID isn't defined. Okay, well, that's because I passed in props, but I'm not using the ID. So let's ID equals props.id. Let's pull that off too, right? So that we have a variable for it. So now we have a handle click method that will call onDelete. So now we can put that here instead if we want. And let's see. We're gonna work. We're gonna work. Awesome. So now it works, right? Because all right, when I click, I call handle click and pass in the event that happened. And this knows to call onDelete. And since I pass the ID into this, I can pass that ID down and event down. And that just gets passed right through here to this function, which gives it the ID and the event information. And that's able to, let's ignore the little magic going on down here right now, right? Let's just say that successfully removes an item out of our notes and re-renders. Yay, magic. Does that sort of make sense if we had changed it so that we're sort of passing that in that way? A little easier to understand? Yes. Which less? All right. So, we can walk through that, right? What happens here is in our app, and this is actually, I think, a really good point to pause, in terms of going deeper into the tutorial and talk about what's going on when we render and then what's going on back in the other direction. Because there's sort of we've built a lot of complex pieces together with all these notes as well. But what's going on right here is each one of these list items is its own note object that got rendered from this notes component. It rendered a separate one using this sort of notes.map notation, which if you remember, we wrote that a different way in the last class to make it a little more explicit. And so each one is a separate note object that got passed in the ID for that specific note. They all got a reference to the same onDelete function, and then they all got, their task name. So then inside of each note, we render the note as a div and a span and a button. So these are all down to HTML elements at this point. And on the button, we added an onClick handler so that when you click it, it will call that handler with the event information of the click that you just fired. So it's passing in that event information. That's what this, gets called with or whatever. And now when that happens, really all this is, handle click or whatever, is using that event information and calling onDelete, which was a property passed into each note from notes, but really it's just a reference to this delete note function over here. And so this guy gets called with the ID and the event and is able to process it. So what's going on here is a little bit of this idea of just passing functions around through different layers that can get called. We're used to, we had over here, we had our hero and our hero dot, we didn't add a method or whatever onto the hero to render or whatever to show something, right? But we could have, and we're used to that, this dot, adding some, calling some things off of my own class in my method, referencing some of my properties. But you can also sort of pass functions around, and that's what's going on with the app.jsx. Is this delete note is really just a function that's getting passed around and getting passed through this notes.jsx into note.this. And it's not even really passing the function. The interesting thing is all it's doing behind the scenes is the app, if this is our memory, we have an app and then we have notes. And then we're going to have a bunch of different notes, right? In this case, we just have note 1 and note 2. Potentially there could be a lot more. So if this is a piece of memory, right? The app has certain things that it has a reference to over here in code in another area. And one of the things app has a reference to is, what did they call it at the app level? Delete note. So app has something called delete note, and you can imagine that it's this pointer or whatever that says delete note. And that's just pointing to this function, right? This function that does something. And then notes has some things that it points to in memory as well. And one of the things that notes has that it points to in memory, because it got passed in, was, what is it called inside of notes? Let me check. It got a property called onDelete. So notes has, some of its own stuff, it points to the list of notes or whatever, but it also points to this. And in there, it's just called onDelete. That's the name that it uses to point to it. And then each one of these notes also has certain properties. They have note 1 points to, it has something called, what is it called? It's called the task. And that's whatever its task name is, learn React. That points to. But this also has something that points up here called onDelete. And all that's doing is pointing at this function. And so that's how note 1 is able to just invoke onDelete and execute it directly. It doesn't even have to go back through this or back through this. It's pointing directly to that same function. You can run the code in that function because we passed that reference down through, and each one of them can point to that function and use it. Does that make sense? Is that the part that you're a little confused by? Yeah.
On ID, when you're creating that note
Yes.
on it, you can just pass it to it, you don't need a reference to it, like this, that ID.
What do you mean? Where?
The note inside the note.
Inside here?
Well, on the, when you're actually
Or-
creating.
Oh, notes.jsx here. That's just because this is using the components function syntax. So instead of these being, this isn't even an object. This is just a function. And so there's two major ways to write React components. There's class syntax, which is being used like over here for the app. And then there's direct function syntax, which is what's being used for like these. You know, a really good example of the direct function is right at the start of this. It separates out the note. And this is a React component, but it's just a function, right? It's something very sort of simple in its implementation. And when you're doing React functions like that, then the props, what would be this dot props, is just the parameter passed into the function directly instead. So it's a little bit of React shorthand, so you don't have to write up a whole class each time for every component. Lets you just write it out a little more simply if you have something very, very simple. And so what's going on in notes.jsx, the reason you don't have to do like this dot props.id is because this is a really complex but still just a function component. And so the ID, the notes, well, you wouldn't have to do this .id anyways, but the notes are getting passed in here, which is that array. And then in this notes.map, which is iterating over each one, for each individual item in that array, it's pulling out the ID and the task one at a time and calling this code inside of there bit by bit. That's why I said, like, that's why in last class I broke this out a lot more, and maybe I'll do it again just to show, you know, how to think about that in another class. But they wrote this code very densely. There is a lot going on in these like 9 lines of code, a ridiculous amount. And when you're, especially when you're just learning how to code, there's just way too much to try and understand, and it's much easier when you break it out into smaller pieces. Heck, for me, I prefer it broken out because I think it's easier to work with. I think we're at time or close enough. So I'm going to revisit going into the difference between bind that they wrote and the way I wrote the on delete in the next class. But a quick, short like explanation for what's going on with that bind is let me see if I can try and explain it. It's like let's say we had this. I'm gonna rewrite my function, my add function now, and it's going to do something really interesting. It's going to take only one number. What it's going to do is it's going to return a new function that takes a number, and I'm just going to call it num here. And that function is going to return the sum of our two numbers. So what's going on now? Okay, now I wrote an add, but it only takes one argument. So I can only pass one thing into it, and I didn't get a value computed back out. What I got was a function returned now from it. So if I really wanted to add something in, I need to assign, let's say I'll assign that function I got back to that. And I'm going to change this name a little bit because add can be confusing. And I'll call it add5, and I'll do a hard-coded version first. So let's do a function add5. And add5 isn't going to take anything because it doesn't need to, because we know what we're going to do. 5, we're going to add 5, right? Oh, shoot. I need to space or shift enter. And this is going to return a function. It's going to take some number, and that's just going to return the number plus 5. So now if I want to be able to add 5 to sort of anything, this is a little weird, but I can either assign this or just sort of invoke it twice. So let's say I'll say I'm going to call this I don't know, let's just say tax is $5 or something. So I'm mapping this. So let's return the results of add5, which is just a function. So add tax is now just a function. It takes whatever number I pass in and returns that plus 5. So I can call it with anything and I get back 10 or 7. I can also do that sort of a shorthand. I could do like, instead of having to assign it something, I could say add5, call that, which I know returns a function, and now I'll call that function with 2 or 6. This is really a little bit complex and hard to read, but what it's doing, and the add5 isn't as clear here. So I'll make this add5 more direct. We'll go back to add something, and this takes a number. And this guy is going to return a function that expects a number and returns that number plus the other number. That's the same syntax as what we just wrote for add5. But now let's create an actual add5 that makes sense here. We'll just call it add5 equals add something 5. So now add5 is a function that will take a value and add 5 to it each time. So you can call it with 3 or 2. What you've done, all we've really done there is essentially store some sort of value that we want to use, a partial computation of our function ahead of time. Add something took one thing and created another function that's essentially saying, oh, I already know what one of my arguments is, so you only need to provide another one. That's what that bind is doing. It's just a little convoluted. It takes a lot to wrap your head around the idea of what they're doing with that bind. I still struggle with these concepts when I look at somebody who writes 15, 20 lines of code to do some of this stuff. It's a whole field in a sense of programming. It's known as functional programming, and it's a very, very powerful model, but it can also take a ton to wrap your head around the way it's working. So we can definitely revisit it again and again, a little bit at a time, but it's a lot of sort of magic going on behind the scenes. I don't know if that cleared anything up or just left everyone incredibly confused at the end here, but it was sort of an important topic and not critical to you guys today, so I'm not worried that much.
Next class, maybe
Make a little more
sense.
sense.
Which is like, oh, you guys want to go over that.
Yeah.
Over it really quick and just let them
That bit right there, I can really mess with your head. Have you ever heard of partial functions, partial applications?